Well, welcome everybody to this panel 2 in this year's World Investment Conference. This is one of on a topic of particular interest to I think to me and to a lot of people, as we feel it's a topic which has emerged with great importance, but yet we still have, I think many of us, trouble wrapping our minds around what it means for us in the day-to-day of investment promotion. So I'm very excited to have this panel of 5 very distinguished panelists. I think if we put all of their experience together for their introductions, it would take the full 50 minutes. So I hope they'll forgive me if I do an abbreviated introduction. It is just a minute after the start time. I hope you all forgive me if I get straight into it, as we have a packed schedule today, and we want to be sure that you're all able to attend as many of these virtual panels as possible. So with me today, and I'll start in alphabetical order, Ms. Anne Chapaz is from the International Trade Center. She's the chief of the Institutions and Ecosystems team. Her team helps helps business support organizations and ecosystems improve their performance and better serve investors and SMEs. Before her work there, she was with the very well known and regarded New Zealand Trade and Enterprise. So she is one of us from way back. She was there for 14 years. And before then, she was working in shipping and export manufacturing for nearly a decade. So indeed, from the private sector and public sector, both, she has deep experience, which is useful to us as investment promoters. Then there's Dr. Henry Lowendahl, who I imagine many of you know as the founder and CEO of WAIPA. He's also the SVP representing FDI Intelligence, which brings us FDI Markets. If I'm not mistaken, Henry, you were the creator behind FDI Markets, so I think we all have you to thank very much for making that available in the investment promotion space. Before these positions, he was at OCO Global, at IBM PLI and PwC, so he's accumulated over 25 years of experience in FDI. He's worked on 150 FDI consulting assignments with economic development organizations and IPAs in over 60 countries. Then we have Mr. Koen Ypers from IBM Plant Location International. He's a managing consultant for IBM's Finance and Supply Chain Transformation Center of Competence and has acquired more than 12 years of cross-functional experience in projects on regional economic development and IPA strategy and research, footprint and supply chain strategy and feasibility studies. His project work includes scenario building and assessment, business case development, operational environment analysis, trend and risk assessment, competitive analysis, and strategy formulation. He's also contributed to the development of IBM's Smarter City Assessment tool, which I believe more than 50 cities are using now. And so in this topic of data for investment promotion, I think he also has something cutting edge to bring to the conversation. Then we have Mr. Matthew Stevenson from the World Economic Forum, where he is the Policy and Community Lead for International Trade and Investment. He manages the Global Investment Policy and Practice Initiative, including projects in 5 countries. He's developed the concept of digital FDI for them. Previously, he worked at International Finance Corporation on advisory services for investment policy, where he led the work stream on outward FDI and co-authored, in fact, the World Bank Group's first publication on outward FDI. So Matthew, it's a great pleasure to have you as well. And finally, I don't know that he's joined us yet, but I expect that he'll be joining us before long, as Mr. Sandro Tolezzi from CINDE, the Costa Rican Investment Promotion Agency, of course, very well known around the world for many years for its leadership in the field. Of course, I think came to our consciousness back in the late 90s for attracting Intel to build their first semiconductor plant in Latin America, which was a big deal, and they set a high bar and have kept meeting that ever since. Sandro is the director of applied research there. He's a specialist in FDI and an economics and international trade professor. Since 2008, he's been in that position at CINDE for director of applied research and monitoring and evaluation. His economic studies with CINDE have contributed to 350 multinational companies setting up operations in the country over the last decade. He's also written and published studies on electronic business and other topics related to industrial organization and peer-reviewed journals. So from that lightning review of the experience and knowledge of our panel, I hope you get the sense that we do have quite a special collection of brain power here and experience, which I hope we will get to tap over the next 50 minutes. For those of you that are joining this as the first panel, you may not know that it's pretty quick paced. There are many to go through. I apologize that this won't really include a Q&A session. We're just going to have a discussion among these panelists that hopefully will help the audience understand what it means to use data in investment promotion and how they can maybe take some steps towards embracing those practices within their respective investment promotion agencies. So before I ask the first question, I just want to give a minute of background to all of you here. When I first saw the title for this session, data-driven investment promotion, I thought, well, investment promotion's always been data-driven, which is just me being a stickler, but it's true, right? I mean, if you've been in the business at all, you know that companies have to choose a location from among many possible locations, and they have to compare the pros and cons of each. They look at, depending on their project, their product, their market, they'll look at market demand and competition, input access and quality, worker skills and wages, utility costs and reliability, transportation times and expenses, taxes, incentives, all of that. And they do it by the numbers, right? And whether it's very formal in some companies or a little less formal in others, there is a sort of calculus there weighing these things against each other. So I think what we mean nowadays when we say data-driven is that technological advances have made the availability of that data much better. The dissemination by governments who are trying to attract investors, by consulting firms that are informing location decisions by these companies, have become easier. So the availability, the cost, the quality, and the comprehensiveness of this data is becoming much greater. So as an investment promoter, if you have some awareness of this and want to take advantage of it to appeal to investors, well, how do we do that? I think it can feel very far removed from our posts in government sometimes. We feel very far removed from the cutting edge of business, of data, even though this is the world we're supposed to bridge to from government. So I believe that after this conversation, you'll have a better sense of what it means to do investment promotion, not investment decision making, but promotion to decision makers using data. I think it will come down to, and I give this sort of introductory statement so that you have a sense of the structure of our conversation, because there's certain things we really want to hit. And we're going to start by talking about data in location decision making, so you have a sense of how companies are making these decisions nowadays. Boone and Henry in particular have a lot of direct experience with companies, and so we'll ask them for their advice. And we also want to know what the stakes are for governments in that competition. If you're able to compete, what's the edge it's going to give you? If you fail to adapt these new capabilities, what is that going to mean in terms of your ability to attract FDI? And then we'll move from there to talking about what can IPAs do about it. Specifically, we're going to talk about strategy. How should data inform your sector selection? What you prioritize for your limited resources. Facilitation, how do you use this data that investors are looking for? How do you collect it and share it with them? How do we use data for lead generation, for investor targeting? Of course, the more proactive among you are going to be very interested in this. And so I hope to get a lot out of this panel from that. And then how do we build the skills for this? And how do IPAs take advantage of the sorts of organizations that are represented by our panelists to build capacity to be able to engage in this? So why does it matter? How do we do it? And how can we build that capacity? This is where I hope we'll go in this conversation. So with that introduction, let's begin. So to our esteemed panelists, that first question, how are technological advances in data collection and analysis changing the way businesses choose where to locate operations? What kind of data specifically do businesses now expect to be able to find that they couldn't find before? And how do they use that in their location decision making? Where do they go for this data? Do they get it on their own? Do they have to outsource it? Do they expect it from governments? And what does it mean in the competition for FDI to be able to get this data and share it with them? So, Koen, if you don't mind, I'd like to start with you for that investor perspective.
Yes. Yes. Okay. Thank you, Carlos, for the introduction. Well, maybe two things on that. I think, first of all, let's say in terms of how we approach location decision-making processes, not a lot has changed yet, I would say. We're still, so data is crucial. And what we're after is really getting an understanding of, let's say, project-specific, sector activity-specific competitiveness of a location. And that's why we need that data. And in that sense, we're still after the same type of data that you mentioned, information around talent, cluster presence, cost information, of course, is crucial, etc. And also there, we're still using the sources, internationally available sources, internationally comparable sources, local statistics, and combine that into an assessment. But that said, that's in itself still a substantial challenge, depending on the type of locations that you're analyzing. In some locations, data availability is much better than in others. And of course, that influences the analysis. And maybe it's a bit of an open door, but I do want to mention it. Something like Eurostat, for instance, I think is still a global benchmark in terms of how you make data available. I know it's not an IPA responsibility in itself, but I think it's important for them to link with these statistics organizations in their country to make sure that information like Eurostat provides, information around talent, around sector presence, around costs that is available even at regional level. That's very interesting information still for us. And that's still the same type of information that we were looking for. And that's the same information as 10 years ago, let's say. But what we do see, and when we talk about the new technologies that are applied in, let's say, analytical process, is that we are a bit, we are seeing that the expectation from our client side in terms of what is available, let's say, remotely, is changing. So usually in a location decision-making process, usually in various steps, and it usually starts with the desk-based step, followed by a validation step where you would really visit locations, talk with people, get a better understanding of more intangibles. And what we're seeing is that there's a bit of an expectation that some of that validation work gets integrated into the remote work, basically. And I think that part of the expectation is also driven by some of the new tools that are available. Let's say an AI tool that scans a very broad set of data, of information, turns unstructured data basically into structured information. Those type of technologies, I think, create an expectation that more of the, let's say, the intangible information around location gets available also through that new technology and basically remotely. And I'm not saying that is not necessarily realistic always, but it's something that we are seeing, that an expectation that from our clients see, okay, a lot, let's say, of the insight, for instance, in relating to labor force, talent market, and the trends that are happening in certain locations, that there is an expectation that we get to know this also, let's say, remotely and desk-based. And of course, that is a challenge for us, but also certainly a challenge for IPAs on how to respond to this and how to make sure that information, it's not just statistics, but that more intangible information is also available somewhere.
Interesting to me that you said that some of the validation work is shifting to remote. So the traditional common sense within investment promotion is you go from the long list to the short list. You've got the desk research at the long list. You have to be sure to get on their radars, but then you've got to be ready to receive them. And so the idea that long-standing step is something that's being rethought is very interesting. So we have to know how are they doing site visits remotely.
Just to add that, of course, there will always still visit the location, of course, in the end. I'm sure, just to reconfirm that's still going to be important. But just sections of that validation work, you see that there is an expectation that it is also already available, or that those insights are already present earlier in the process, basically.
Right. So what's available for the desk research stage has increased, and so by failing to adapt to that, we're going to lose out on our competitiveness. You also mentioned AI. Koen, you could address it, or Henry, maybe this is a good point to bring you in. I know you have a lot of direct work with statistics and its analysis. AI is something that is thrown out in these discussions all the time. where is it? Is this the know-how of the firms that are doing the analysis internally? Is it something that only a few specialized consulting firms have out there and are hired to use? Should governments be building those capacities for it? What does it mean that AI is now a part of this discussion? And of course, use that as a segue into whatever other thoughts you have on this broader topic of how business is using these new technologies to make decisions.
Is that a question for me, Carlos?
It is. I'm sorry. Yeah.
Well, maybe we can revert back to Cone just in terms of how perhaps businesses are using it for their site selection, because he would have, I'm sure, a lot more knowledge than me on that. But I think just generally when we talk about location data, that there needs to be some there needs to be the kind of fundamental distinction between different types of foreign direct investment. When we're looking at a greenfield, I guess Plant Location International, like a greenfield plant or any greenfield operation, I think that follows this kind of process which Kona outlined, and it's changing, in terms of how we do it, but the process, has been around for a long time. But then if we're talking about other types of FDI, talking about, a sovereign wealth fund from Abu Dhabi, investing in an infrastructure project, or Hilton, where I am at right now, looking at which hotels they want to kind of manage. It's a completely different type of type of FDI, which requires totally different data. I mean, it's a completely different process. So I think that has to be the starting point as an IPA. What kind of FDI are you trying to attract? And the likelihood is increasingly the IPAs are looking for both types. You want your greenfield investment because that gives all the huge economic development benefits, and you've got companies like IBM PLI, which are advising a huge number of major companies on where to establish those operations, and all the data underpinning that. But then you have projects. You have your solar tenders, your infrastructure projects, your property developments, etc. All those types of investments which require project financing, which has been extremely resilient throughout the whole pandemic. I think it only declined by 5% during the pandemic, according to UNCTAD data. So that requires completely different types of data. You need to have data on that project, and that could be a company looking for a foreign investor, and that kind of data you need is totally different. So I think first we have to make that real distinction between what type of FDI we're talking about, because the data needs are different. And then in terms of the kind of IP, I guess there's three types of data: data on your location and projects, as I just mentioned, data on investors, so that's, as you mentioned, FDI markets, other databases. It's part of a solution to collecting intelligence, but it requires a lot more work than just buying a database. You need to be doing researching investors extremely thoroughly, collecting data on them, using social media to find contacts. So the whole corporate intelligence function or business intelligence function of an IPA is critical to success, because otherwise, who are you targeting? You need to know which companies you're targeting for investment. And that's where like an IPA like Cindy, has excelled at that for a period of decades in that highly targeted approach, having the data on investors, knowing who to target. And then the third data source, which is critical for IPAs, is your leads, your investment pipeline. How do you manage all of your leads, all of your interactions with investors to close deals and manage and ensure that you optimize your performance? So those are the three types of data which I think are most important. Just very finally, on the technology side, so I'm not really aware of AI, how it's used for location search from a corporate perspective. So maybe can come back on that. But in terms of how AI is used for the second data source, I said, corporate intelligence on investors. So we built an AI program, which is still being finalized, but we've been doing it for several years with as part of an EU R&D program called Alchemy. And our AI program, is basically tracking tens of thousands of sources to find intelligence on companies which are expanding internationally. So, I mean, AI, from kind of the IPA's perspective, I think that's a key area to look at, is how you can use AI to get intelligence on companies. To use AI to collect intelligence on your location to give to investors, my personal view is that may be more for the private sector to provide a tool like that, but I could be wrong. And then just finally, in terms of other types of technology, because that was your question initially, what we see in the US, as probably, but not probably, definitely the leader, GIS, mapping, they've been doing it for more than a decade. I think at least maybe 400 or 500 IPAs or EDOs, as they're called in the US, have GIS mapping now on their websites, and all the site selectors and so on can use that. And then virtual reality. I mean, as Koen said, companies in the end need to visit their location to make for a greenfield project. But during the pandemic, that's been challenging. And anyway, if you're a peripheral location, it's very hard to get investors to come on site visits. Anyway, so using virtual reality site visits is a trend which is really rapidly emerging in the US now. So they can actually, when they're doing a meeting with an investor, they send them the goggles, put them on, and then they can actually do a tour of the location. Now, be really interested to hear from Koen, is that, how do investors see that? Is it useful or not? But that's a trend we see in IPAs. Thank you.
Thank you, Henry. Before we go back to Koen, I would like to hear your thoughts on AI. Before we do that, I want to just highlight that you've broken down very nicely for Henry the areas in which data is important. You talked about different data needs in different sectors. As we move through the conversation, I hope we get into a discussion about which sectors are really having the highest demand. I want to park that question a little bit, but are there certain sectors in which the nature of the projects are such that there is a higher expectation of certain kinds of data? Now, you talked about at least two types there, the ones that are sort of government conceived, the tenders for infrastructure projects, and those you would expect need to be very fully developed by the government in concept at least. And I think I want to stop there for a second, because I think a lot of you investment promoters listening may come from organizations that do focus on those projects a lot, and others of you are focused on investor conceived projects where you're marketing sectors as opposed to projects. So I just want to make sure that our audience is keeping that in mind, that we have this large community of investment promotion agencies with many mandates that are tasked with different things. So as you go through this, think about how it applies to your particular mandate or area of focus. And of course, Henry, you also talked about the use in lead generation, or figuring out which investors to target. And we will come back to that topic in a few minutes. So I definitely want to hear more there. And I think it's something of particular interest to a lot of our audience. But Koen, on this question of AI, where is it in the process? Who owns it? Who's developing it? And how should IPAs expect it to affect what they do or they present to investors?
Yeah, up to now, it's of course still very limited the usage, but it is indeed very much in line with what Henry explained. It's basically what companies are trying to do with AI is really getting their heads around a very large set of data, basically. So scanning a very large set of sources, scanning a large set of data in search for various things. It could be indeed investments or companies, but it can be any other subject. It's typically related around risk, being able to identify risk, but you could also use it to identify, for instance, elements, changes, trends around talent in certain markets, etc. That's, I think, the way companies are currently using it, and that's also where what I mentioned earlier, this expectation is coming from. Okay, when we use this, we should also be able to get this type of views or insights into markets that we're analyzing. Similarly, as we would be analyzing a certain risk that we're trying to understand, for instance. So that's, I think, a bit the way companies are trying to apply it. And so I think, and it's true, I think it's more applied by companies rather than IPA should be applying it. I think the question then is, however, how as an IPA do you respond to this? How can you make sure that you are basically represented in that very large set of data? And I think there it's important that IPAs realize this, and that they need to make sure that they're indeed very well represented online on a very broad set of channels, basically. And I think that transparency in that context is very important. So basically make sure that a lot of that you publish or that someone else publishes a lot of the things that are happening in your market around sectors, around talent, around education, around policy change, around studies that you perhaps doing, making sure that all that information is made available, that you're transparent about your location. I think that's very important, actually.
Thinking about your earlier point that the IPAs themselves are not the ones to generate most of this data, it means that they have to be in better touch with the Central Bureau of Statistics or whomever it is that's generating this, to make sure it's getting out in the way needs to be. So it's a coordination function there, I guess. Yeah, awareness raising among partners.
Yeah.
In a way, I'm very encouraged to hear that your answer talks about how companies are trying to do these things, and that it's a new field, which tells me that as investment promoters, we're not too late. We haven't already fallen so far behind that we're never going to catch up. The field is developing, and if we start paying attention to it now and learn to leverage it for our benefit, then there's still time to catch the train. Is that right?
Yeah, certainly. And also, I just wanted to add also just that is, I think, all the things that I started with, let's say the more old school approach, or is also still very important. There's a lot of room for improvement on that front in many locations around the world also still. I think that's, and that's also still going to be very important. So
it's an evolution and not a completely new world.
No.
Okay, great. Well, so Matthew, I'd like to hear from you. What is at stake for governments in missing the train, right? If now's the time to build up capacities, how do they do that? With WEF and of course all your other your various experiences in other international organizations. I expect you have a strong sense of sort of a global capacity for leveraging data and the sort of support that's out there, and a lot of discussion has probably gone on around policy and how governments need to organize to catch the train. So what's at stake by missing the train?
Thanks a lot, Carlos, and thank you for the opportunity to be part of this exciting panel with these august panelists who I've had a chance to work with before. Just to preface that my remarks are in a personal capacity and not necessarily the WEF position on this issue. I was thinking about your question, and I had 5 points I'd like to share with you today, and then I'll maybe apply them in a couple different sectors after that. And I think you prefaced a little bit one point I was going to make when you mentioned that a lot of the data is in different parts of government, and it's not always with the IPAs, and it's sometimes with the Central Bureau of Statistics. One of the things I've seen working with governments around the world is that often the data is in different parts of the government. For instance, surprisingly, sometimes it's not surprisingly, but it's good to be aware, it's often with the central bank. And so it would be very important for the IPA and the central bank to have better communication or to ensure communication is there, because maybe that data is very important to an IPA's decision-making and strategy and facilitation. So the first point is about that government coordination, what's already there for the data to be used. The second point, what I've seen work well too, is to request or require a reporting requirement of firms, but not necessarily an approval requirement, so that you get the data, you capture it more readily and more quickly. And that allows governments to know what's happening in terms of the sectors and the flows and so forth. Sometimes governments don't know where the investment is taking place, and that limits their ability to target and facilitate. So I would say report, but don't necessarily require that reporting always to be an approval step. Otherwise, you don't get the data quickly enough. The third point, is I do think there's a role for government, because when the government collects data and then shares it publicly, there is a sense of confidence and the quality, the authenticity, and the reliability of this data. And I think that's important. And the fourth point, I would say, is to be transparent, to put it on a website, to share it so that everybody can see the same data. I think that that's very empowering for investors and not only investors, here's the fifth point, but anybody who's doing market analysis. Including consulting firms, WAPTEC, IBM, and others. But what we've also seen is that there may be some studies, academic or analytical studies, that can show trends, and you can start to see patterns, and you can make more informed decisions when you sort of take the macro view. And so I think that transparency on the data and making it available to everyone allows for some forecasting, allows for some econometric analysis of trends and so forth. So those are my 5 points. The two things that I'd like to also add are sectoral based or more specific. And that's, we have been following closely and studying what I like to call digital FDI, and this is FDI in the digital economy. And I think this is very important to keep track of this kind of data. And what we found looking at what's out there is that there are two sectors in particular that may be particularly empowering and enabling for the digital economy, and that's telecoms and that's IT services. And so if you don't know what's going on in those sectors in terms of investment flows, projects, and values, then as a government, you might be a little blind in terms of the importance of facilitating, promoting investment in those sectors, because they're going to be enablers across your economy as you become more, as you need to be digitally strong and competitive in this modern age. So that's one final point. And then the last point is the importance not just to look at inward FDI, but outward FDI. What I've seen talking to governments is that they often don't look at that, and they don't always track that, and then they're not aware of what's happening. But knowing what's happening can be very empowering, because increasingly it can be a complementary channel to support outward as well as attract inward, and help your economy grow that way. So I'd encourage governments, IPAs, and others to try to keep track of the outward FDI data as well. Thank you.
I'm glad for the work you've done in that area, because it is a sort of a bit of a blind spot in this space. I found it interesting that you raised the policy issues in terms of a government developing its telecom sector. It's doing things to support the growth of IT services. So it's not just about using what's out there. You have to have the foundation to be able to participate in the first place, right? And if we are all going to benefit from a digital transformation, we need to digitally transform. And so IPAs that both want to make use of this in promoting investment and want to perhaps go after companies that are going to help that sector grow within their countries need to do it from the promotional side, but also as advocates in government to make sure that the foundational infrastructure and policy is in place. I found it very interesting that you mentioned the idea of IPAs, or governments collecting data on companies. What are the things that you think are most essential that they are tracking, and how do you do that in a way that, as you were hinting at, isn't onerous? I do know some IPAs that feel it's their responsibility to find out everything about every project that's going on, and it turns them into sort of a really slow-moving, half research body, half policy body, and they forget all about the promotion. But of course, there are other parts of government that are better at doing that have natural touch points with businesses and are already collecting a lot of good data. So what do you see as being the most important kinds of data, and where should it be collected in government?
Is that a question back to me, Carlos?
It is, yes.
Yes, maybe at one point, before I answer your question directly, I think because listening to this conversation, I think there's one really interesting thing I'd like to share, and that's sort of the thought that there's digital measures to facilitate investment flows. So how can you do that through AI? How can you do that through virtual reality? And then there's investment in the digital sectors. So you kind of have to think about this new age in two different ways. Use technology to better facilitate investment, and then facilitate investment into areas of technology. And I find that really important to think of those as complementary, and to think of those two as two different things that IPAs need to do, if you see what I mean. So that's something I've been working on and trying to work with others on. In terms of the information that can be captured, the data, I mean, I think my panelists may be more savvy than me, but what I've seen work well is just a simple survey or reporting, a piece of paper or now online, which just captures the project and sector and of a company without it being onerous. One page and where, when, what, how kind of thing. Very simple, and not, again, not to approve, because as soon as you try to approve anything, it slows it down, just as an information sharing mechanism.
Right. Okay, great. Well, thank you to the three of you that have spoken so far. I think you've laid out the context very nicely about what businesses are doing, what how data is being used and what's at stake. And I'm now going to turn to you. And I think most of the heavy lifting for the rest of the conversation has come from you, because you here represent the world of IPAs, I think, in your role as chief of the section that is meant to strengthen business supporting institutions. I think you touch on a lot of experiences around the world. Of course, you come from New Zealand Trade and Enterprise. I know that you know the CINDA case very well. I think you guys work together. If I'm not mistaken, they do some sort of consulting even for ITC. So I'm hoping that in these next couple of questions, you'll shed a lot of light on how IPAs can take all of this and put it to use in first of all, setting strategy. How do they decide what sectors to focus on using data that's out there to make better decisions? How do they use it for facilitation in those sectors? How do they generate leads in those sectors and follow up with them? I'm going to throw all three of those questions to you at the same time. Just to be sure that you have a chance to address all of them. And then I think after that, we'll kind of go back to a broader discussion. So go ahead and take a little extra time if you'd like. I want to make sure we have enough for it.
Okay, thank you very much. And yes, it's a pleasure to be part of the panel. So yeah, a lot of questions there. Let's start on the idea about how do you use data to get some sector-specific prioritization in the strategy for a government or for an IPA. They cannot be all things to all people. They're going to have to make some tough decisions about where they allocate resource and where they start paying attention. So of course, there's a real advantage in being able to understand and focus on some niche, highly competitive subsectors where there can be some kind of compelling selling proposition to investors. So that means understanding not only the sectors and where they've got comparative and competitive advantage by sector, but also the general competitive factors that have already been mentioned today. So the resources, the wage costs, the skills, fiscal advantages, the country brand, all those kinds of elements that add another competitive factor. The other thing they need to understand is how those elements vary geographically, because investment is often about place. So, you cannot claim to have a competitive advantage right across the whole country if you don't have infrastructure outside the main urban centers, for example. So be aware how that competitive advantage might change and vary geographically. And of course, you need to understand how that compares with your competitor countries. So for each of the sectors that appear to have a competitive advantage, you need to understand, who are you playing against and what do they offer in that area. And then, of course, it's about designing the strategies that enhance and promote that sector/location mix to targeted investors. So this is important, with a really well-researched and articulated value proposition. So targeted sectors, targeted locations, targeted investors, and a very precise, clearly defined value proposition that understands who you're competing against. So of course, data is really important to get that, because people want hard facts. Comparable data is not easy to find. I mean, there are some great tools, and we know we're talking about some of them today. But it's not the same as being able to capture data from customs officials that stamp a document as you go across the border. There's difficulty with definitions. How do you value FDI over a number of years? There's huge lumpiness in the data. So if you look at longitudinal data of FDI flows over a number of years, you can go from, in one country, you can go from 15 billion in 2015 to 0 in 2016. So it's incredibly lumpy, which means looking at trends, you need to take into account that lumpiness. And of course, there's the issue about confidentiality. So of course, a big investor will hold information about their investment decisions very close to their chest for a long time, because they're giving out information to their own competitors. So, and one of the big risks for an IPA these days is that with access to lots of data, they also access the risk of managing and maintaining that confidentiality of that data. So this is something they need to take into account in their risk for profile. So you need to look at comparative rather than absolute data. And I think this is something that's echoed a lot. You need to weigh what the data tells you with other research. particularly on the ground, historically, talk to people anecdotally. The data you get from these public sources will help you ask the questions. It won't necessarily give you the answers. Now, there are some good data sources around. We've mentioned the one that from Henry. From ITC, there's some things that are interesting for investors for sure. There's the investment map that you can check out. This talks about historic investment flows into your country and into your competitor countries, what sectors they're coming from, and you know, where they're choosing to invest if they're not investing with you. It also talks about what multinationals already have subsidiaries in your country. So, you know, the aftercare opportunity is always one that's worth looking at. And it also can tell you which multinationals are investing in your competitor countries. There's the market access map, which is particularly interested for market-seeking investors. So this talks about which markets you can offer preferential access to for investors and how do your competitor countries compare. There's the export potential map, also for market or resource-seeking investors. So this shows which sectors in your country show potential for export-led growth. And then there's the other option which is to look at detailed firm level information, which can really just give a picture about how competitive firms can be in your country. It talks about how well they can connect, how well they can compete, how well they can change. And we have an SME competitiveness survey, which allows that to come up. So there are these data-driven approaches, and they give you kind of a starting point at which you can then narrow down for more detailed data collection. And I think at this stage, you're going to have to start looking at some of those other elements, AI, etc., etc. I do want to say something really important, though, is that there are a lot of other elements which would come into that sector decision making. And, you know, I'm a UN organization, so I want to emphasize that it's not just about any investment. It's got to be good, smart, sustainable and inclusive investment. So you're going to have to try and find data on things like which sectors are likely to employ or upskill youth, which sectors can create jobs outside the main urban areas, which sectors can be competitive without damaging the environment, which sectors will help build a positive national or sector brand, which sectors have a strong multiplier effect into the broader economy because of the potential for productive linkages. So it's not just about how much FDI dollars are we going to get in our pocket. And this will need a lot of good local research, potentially in conjunction with a reputable university. Another really important thing, and then we'll move on to the lead generation stuff. When you look at this data that I've talked about on these platforms, remember that we're looking in the past and we've just gone through this massive disruption process. So looking at historic flows will not necessarily tell you what the opportunity is in the next 5 to 10 years. The world has changed. And, you know, this is why things like AI are really interesting, because it's looking at data that's happening now. It's very current information, and it's how it allows us to see what's changed just in the last 6 months. I saw some really interesting comments from UNCTAD, from James Zahn, about what this will mean, what the big changes that are going on in value chains, in multilateral and regional negotiations. These big changes are changing in the way that IPA needs to be considered. He was saying 3 big insights. One, about the fact that IPAs will be looking at broadening their export-led strategies to extend to investment for regional markets and sub-regional industrial clustering. So we're talking about a bit more nearshoring in this regard, or friend-shoring, which I thought was a really interesting new way of looking at, you know, investing in countries where you know you're going to get stability and consistent, friendly environment. He talks about attracting diversified investments based on the flexibility and resilience of global value chains. So investors might want to diversify and have their investments in several different countries to diversify their risk. So what's the position of an IPA to present themselves as an alternative diversified investment location? And then thirdly, intensifying efforts to promote investment in green and blue economies, as well as sustainable infrastructure and public services. So just some ideas about how you might need different types of data and that looking backwards at data will not tell you this interesting new world that we're now in. So that was what I want to say in that first area. Carlos, do you want me to keep talking about lead generation at this stage, or flip to another area?
I think that would be an area where there's potentially a lot of interest. But I think I would like to ask, I hate to say it, but maybe one potentially last question to the group as a whole, and maybe you can bring lead generation into that. And this is really for everyone. And I hope it's not a tough one. It certainly is for me, and any light you can shed on would be much appreciated. So thinking as an IPA, what are some innovative things I can do to take advantage of these new capabilities, these new data sources, new types of data? I think you've all really done a great job of painting a picture of how I need to use data as an investment promoter. Is there something, some new source out there that I can take advantage of? Anne, you mentioned how hard it is to find country comparative data. When I've tried comparing sites in terms of water costs, time to port, all the nitty-gritty details that companies look at, it takes time. You can find it, but you have to spend a lot of time discovering new sources. Well, I see Matthew's raised his hand, so you have some great new resource we can all tap into.
I'll be very quick because I think Henry also wanted to come in. One very exciting new thing I think IPAs can do, which a few are starting to do, is collect ESG data. And I think that there's a lot of ESG earmarked capital out there that wants to invest sustainably. And we worked with Cambodia to create a supplier database with sustainability dimensions. So the firms could designate what ESG operations they had, when it came to environment, gender, training, and so forth, employee care and protection. And then that could help match new sources of capital that we're seeking to invest according to these practices. So I would encourage all IPAs to potentially think about that, to tap into the growing trillions of dollars in ESG capital. Thanks.
Are there international rankings, or how would an IPA go about starting to collect data on individual companies or sources of finance based on that? How would they compare them? And yeah.
Well, I mean, what Cambodia has done is to, in their supplier database, they've invited the companies to self-designate with evidence their ESG activities. And so that's how they transparently, and now the capital can identify those kinds of companies that it seeks to invest in. Thanks. Okay.
Did anybody else want to comment on the general question, Henry? Yeah.
Yeah, like very quickly. I mean, there's some, and it kind of relates back to Koen's kind of comments about, providing data. I think you covered that really well. Mine's more about the kind of projects, which relates to exactly this ESG point as well. Projects which companies can invest in. And it's extremely difficult to find information on projects companies can invest in. And to give an example, so I think it was launched yesterday, perhaps, but I saw the press release yesterday. The DIT, the UK's national IPA, they just launched the new UK Investment Atlas. And I looked at it this morning. You go onto it, you can choose your sectors or you can choose your regions of the UK, and it just lists the projects available for companies to invest in. And it's a really simple, intuitive, easy to use map, which any IPA in the world should be able to do. So I think that's critical, as well as the kind of data which investors need on skills, costs, all the stuff which Koen talked about. And the more you provide, the more AI and site selectors like IBM PLI can pick up. Also, you have to present your project opportunities for investors and keep that updated and make it, what you see is like, I mean, I can think of lots of examples without saying any names, but IPAs, they provide like a 200 or 300, and some of these are top IPAs, like a 200 or 300 page PDF of all the projects. I mean, it's impossible for an investor to navigate. It's out of date by the time it's published. But that's what everyone's doing. So, I mean, I'd recommend people look at the UK Investment Atlas to get an alternative way of really simply presenting projects to investors. And just finally, the previous discussion on investment data and tracking, which you asked, I think, again, I have to make the distinction between the different types of FDI. FDI flows are generally tracked by a central bank, or in some cases like the US National Statistics Agency, but generally central banks. FDI flows data, which then goes into UNCTAD, World Bank, and IMF, OECD data, is very different to the data which IPAs are tracking, because they're not interested. Well, they might have a mandate for FDI flows, but the investment they're tracking is actual project level data. And like to track that project level data, either you regulate it. So I would say probably the best examples in the world is Indonesia, where companies have to report quarterly on the status of their capital investment and jobs, and it's published for the whole world. So you can get quarterly updates. I mean, it's for the whole, for a huge country like Indonesia, it's amazing what they've done. The IPA has to, as you said, has to track the companies it's working with and follow up with those companies regularly. Or the third option is like what they do in, say, Dubai or Abu Dhabi or Sharjah, and we support them with that, is basically track all the investments taking place. Using media, using AI, all the sources out there with stakeholders to build up a comprehensive picture of the actual investments coming. But I think it's super important to make that distinction between FDI flows and then investment projects, which IPAs are attracting.
And tracking data and collecting data either directly or by other means, as you say, that in UAE.
Yeah.
Very interesting. And do you have some examples from Costa Rica, Finland?
Sure, yeah, and I think there's some really interesting things coming out of this, which is, yes, you can hopefully get data. What you need to do is transform that data into something that's meaningful for the investor in ways that they can obtain easily and do something with. And for me, there's kind of two approaches with that. This means, of course, you need some really good skills within your IPA, so we can talk about that as well. But there's two kind of approaches, and the best is to combine the two. So one is this kind of modern lead generation and research capacity that we see coming out of Cinde. And this means that you use a really good website, really well-designed website, to track who is coming onto your website, where they are looking at things. You track back to the URL, find out which company it is. You go into advanced social media search, LinkedIn, Professional, etc., to find out which person at that company might possibly be doing that kind of tracking. You then do a whole lot of research on that company and on that sector, and this is where Sandro is a master. And then they write an incredibly customized approach to that person at that company to say, we think somebody from your company was looking at our website recently. We can see that for your company, this could be really interesting because of this, that we now know about your sector and your company. And we think we've got the answers to your problems. So they have this incredibly narrowed down funnel because they put the research in at that suspect prospect stage and have an incredibly good conversion rate because they do this highly customized approach to transform data into something that is meaningful and valuable. So that's one approach. The other approach is what you're talking about with DIT, where the data is used in platforms where the individual investor can find the information out themselves by entering in certain fields. The UK one's interesting. I was looking at one just the other day from Finland, which is it's a cost calculator. And you can just plug in the type of professional you want to hire, an accountant or a marketing specialist or a software analyst, and it gives you all the costs to have that particular person on your staff. Very quick. You don't have to do anything except put in the type of person you want to hire. This is brilliant. It's so easy. It's backed up by good data that is transformed into an incredibly user-friendly interface. So I think that's really important, and it needs the skills in the IPA to do it or to find those skills externally. So those are kind of the examples I wanted to give you. But I think there's another question here, which is that, again, data is important, but it's not sufficient. So if you've got good data, how do you make sure that your organization, your IPA, can use that data and deliver the service that the investor needs? So it's not just about data, it's also about professionalism, responsiveness, confidential data. It's about agility. It's about how well you can talk tech to techies, how well you can talk business to business people. What is your ability to connect to government, to advocate, to change the situation? And what are the tools you can use to do that? Again, there's some great examples from Costa Rica on how that's being done. And just a final question, response to Matthew's point about ESG. We're just starting to get up to speed with this now, and all our assessment models for the way in which we assess performance for IPAs are being adjusted to measure the way in which they are also able to incorporate elements of gender, youth, social responsibility, and environment into the work they do as an IPA. So it's mainstreamed across how they operate, how they select sectors, how they segment their customers, how they deliver their services. We're actually piloting, testing it next week with Cindy. So we will be able to see what excellent looks like, and then we're going to make everybody else try and meet the same ambitious level in this area. So definitely this is now being mainstreamed across the way investment is being done.
I think that this last flurry of great examples, ideas about how to apply the things we've been talking about is a great way to, unfortunately, end this conversation. I'm getting the hook and being pulled off stage because we have to make room for the next panel. But I really thank you all. That was a great flurry, and I like that point at the end, or just the penultimate point about necessary but not sufficient. We're all talking about data here, but we also need a culture in these IPAs of valuing data. If you're not doing good monitoring and evaluation of your performance as an organization, of your staff, if you're not tracking companies with a CRM, you're not making the most of the old school data requirements. So we have to get the basics and build on that with all these great examples that you gave us here at the end. A lot to think about. We really appreciate it. And I hate to say it, but we'll have to wrap up there. So thank you all very much to all the panelists, and I hope we can continue these conversations on the sidelines, and invite anybody watching to reach out to WIPA, with any questions following up on these topics with these panels or with WIPA or me, please. So thank you again.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody. Have a nice day.